welcome back to the MRC Tune channel. We are here on week 2 of our video series on general modification for performance cars, I guess. So I want to tell everybody thank you for watching last week's video on fuel systems, and I really appreciate all the subscribers. And if you enjoy this stuff, I would invite you to please click on the subscribe button down below and show some love and support the channel. And I plan to keep making these videos every week, so I hope you enjoy them. So today's topic is going to be engine management systems. So like everything else on a car, you kind of have to have a goal. And the goal is essentially not, for an ECU, isn't just how much power you're going to make, because pretty much any ECU out nowadays on the market is going to handle quite a fair amount of horsepower, but it's how user-friendly is it? How easy is it going to be to install? How easy is it going to be to calibrate? And how easy is it going to be for somebody to tune that engine with that engine management system on it? So you got to have kind of a goal on how streetable the car is going to be as well. There are some sensor choices that change how the car is going to drive, and we'll talk about that in a second. But number one, when you're choosing an ECU, is going to be most likely your sensor inputs and your outputs. If you've got a 10-cylinder engine, you can't use an ECU that's only made for a 4-cylinder engine, obviously. So you need to know how many sensors your engine has, or how many inputs and outputs you need minimum to make that engine run. Everything after that's going to be a bonus. So it can be anything from boost control to launch control to external sensors like shock sensors and speed sensors. You can add sensors for just about anything on a car nowadays. So that's what you really need to look at first, is how many inputs and outputs does my car have. An input is a sensor, an output would be like a boost control solenoid, a fuel injector, or a ignition coil. Those are outputs. So it needs a lot more inputs than it does outputs to come up with an equation to know how much fuel to give the engine and when to fire the spark plug. So another thing would be who's going to be tuning this ECU, because if you can spend $10,000 on an ECU like a Motec, but if nobody in the area can tune it, because it is very complex, you're going to have a pretty big issue on your hands, and you've spent a lot of money that you're not going to be able to take full advantage of. So if you have a newer, or like a expensive ECU in mind, just make sure somebody in the area can actually tune that. You do have another option these days, which is remote tuning, and what that is a higher profile tuner, somebody that can run with a Motec and knows and understands it, can actually log into your computer from whatever state they're in and actually control your car and tuning on a dyno elsewhere. And that's a really good option these days. I've done it myself. It works pretty good. So that's an option. So it doesn't really count anything out nowadays, but it still would be nice to have somebody in the area that would be able to give you support if you had issues. That's probably the main reason why you'd want to stick with something that the local shops would know how to work on. But as far as what brands are good or bad, they're all pretty good. Just depends on how easily you want the installation to go and all of that stuff. It can get pretty complex with some of these higher end ECU manufacturers. So the next part would be custom wiring or plug and play. A lot of companies will sell both. On a newer vehicle, plug and play is definitely the easiest. There's really no sense in changing everything unless you're trying to do something really custom. But most of the time, the modern wiring systems on vehicles are great, so you don't really need to worry about them. However, on the Supra, the Mark III especially, there are a lot of connectors on that engine that don't have any weather seals. So your connectors get moisture in them, and you get resistance in the wires. And if you go to a high performance ECU, it's going to notice that. You're going to have headaches trying to tune it with all these bad connections that you've got. So for instance, I've got a wiring harness here that I have in from a customer that I'm doing some work on. I built this harness for a 1JZ in a Mark III Supra, and when this is all installed in the car, it's very neat. You don't hardly see any of it, and It's made with very high quality wire. All of these connectors are weather tight. So it really does take something old and breathe a lot of new life into it. And there's a lot of people out there that can make harnesses, but if you have something newer or your wiring is in really good condition, you can buy a plug-and-play ECU for quite a few vehicles nowadays, and it'll make it a lot simpler. It's literally just unplug the stock one and plug in the new one, and you've got all these extra features on it. So if you're custom wiring, another big thing is that ECU a ground control ECU, or can it do power and ground control? What I mean by that is a Megasquirt system, which is probably the most budget friendly, however, takes the most do-it-yourself work. That is a ground control system only. So that ECU cannot send power from it to control any device. You have to actually send fused power to a device, and you control the ground with the Megasquirt. So like a boost control solenoid, you would have to run a 5 amp fused power to that boost control solenoid, and the ECU has to ground it. Now with a different ECU, like let's say the Holley Dominator or any of the Holley products, which are excellent, that's a more of a middle of the road, but a lot of high-end cars are using that system. But that ECU can actually send some smaller currents out of it, up to 2 amps per channel. So you've got a lot more options when it comes to wiring the car on an ECU like that, because you can send power, you can send ground, you can send a frequency signal, you can do all kinds of things with that ECU on the same pin. So when you're wiring it, it becomes a lot easier, because now you don't have to maybe switch some things to a ground control circuit that maybe weren't ground control from the factory, which you can do, but it can get kind of messy and complicated. So that's another thing to look at, is if you're custom wiring, spending a little more on an ECU that you can actually reassign functions to those pins is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headache. You have to understand about your engine, like what is the minimum that you want to control. If you build an engine and it's naturally aspirated, and you wire the car up and you decide to put a turbo on it later, well, if you have boost control, you want to add boost control or boost control solenoid controlled by the ECU, you're going to have to add all that in. So you want to try to come up with a really good future plan on what you plan to do with that engine, and wire it accordingly, and have the ECU set up accordingly, and have the ECU that can provide enough inputs and extra outputs to control extras, nitrous, turbo, wheel speed sensors, shock sensors, things like that. Another big thing with ECUs is fly-by-wire throttle control. A lot of the newer LS stuff, anything from about 2000 to 2001 and up, are a fly-by-wire throttle. So there is no throttle cable. Now something like a Megasquirt or some of the other ECUs out there they can't control that. They can't control an electronic throttle body. Now Holley and Haltech and some of those higher end brands can actually control those, but there again, you're adding some more wires and some more things to it, and some more tuning options, which actually can be very nice to have that electronic throttle. But just make sure, if you have one, you got to have an ECU that supports that. Another thing you need to be aware of is high and low impedance injector control. Basically, any ECU can control a high impedance injector. However, a low impedance injector is where the problems come in. That's a very precise part of the software and firmware and hardware in that ECU to control a low impedance injector properly. And you can add a resistor pack to the injector to be able to use a low Z injector on a high Z ECU. But if you try to use a low impedance injector on an ECU that can't handle that, you will possibly burn out the ECU and or the injector. So if you've got low impedance injectors, and if you don't know what that is, refer to the video before this one. You'll need to make sure your ECU supports whatever injectors you have. Some ECUs will actually control 2 sets of injectors, so you can stage them. That's good for a 4-cylinder if you've got really need a lot of fuel demand and you still want to street the car, you can have a small set of injectors for drivability and a larger one for horsepower. So another thing with ECUs is being able to add custom features, custom tables, and custom algorithms to do some things that maybe you want to do that didn't come with from the factory. And the higher end ECUs are going to allow you to do a lot more of that. They give you more control over everything, or if you're not the one tuning it, your tuner is going to really appreciate if you get something that he can possibly add something in that wasn't part of the package deal. You also can't be afraid to run custom sensors on an engine to get it to work. The 7M GT is a classic example. The crank and cam sensor are terrible on those things, especially when they get older. So like what I did on my Mark III Supra, my 7M GT, was add a 36 tooth laser cut wheel to the front of the crankshaft with a sensor on it, and that way I could accurately measure the crankshaft position on the Megasquirt 3 that I was using to control it. And you just can't be afraid of using custom sensors on an engine if you know how it works and you understand it. Just because a certain ECU doesn't support your engine doesn't mean it can't make it run. It just means that it can't support the factory sensors that are on that engine, so you may have to do some custom work, but it can be done. And there's a lot of options out there for each scenario and each problem that arises. There's usually quite a few different options you can go with that will all work. There isn't an engine out there that you can't fuel inject and use this on with enough work. So that's another thing to think about. And I've got, this is another big one, is coil control, smart coil control. So a lot of the aftermarket ECUs nowadays really shine when you use a coil like this, because this is one coil per cylinder, and this is called a smart coil. So the ECU can actually control this directly, and that allows you to do some pretty cool stuff with the ignition side of things. Engine management systems can actually trim on a per cylinder basis, so you can actually add or subtract timing to individual cylinders or add and subtract fuel to individual cylinders. That's another thing you'll want to look at to see if your ECU you're looking at has that feature. And there are a lot of options out there, but just make sure to look at all of them with a critical eye and write down a list of everything that you need in an ECU, so that way as you're searching around you can find one that meets all those criteria. Then decide, okay, what would I like to have? What might I do in the future? And that's where you need to start looking at the auxiliary options for those ECU units. So that's basically just an intro to electronic control units. There's a lot more to them than what I've just stated, but it'll at least give you an idea of what you need to be thinking about for the tuning side of things, because a really well-built mechanical engine isn't going to do you a whole lot if you don't have a computer that can control it to get the power that you want out of it. So don't be afraid to really do your research on the engine control unit side of things, because it is an investment really in your engine, and it can actually save that engine if something goes wrong. So that basically wraps up today's lesson. Thank you guys all for watching very much. If you liked watching this, please subscribe below. Please comment. I do read the comments and try to reply to them as I can. So thank you for watching. We will see you next week for the next video. Thank you. Bye.